A barber in Memphis was losing everything: his shop, his home, and the one kidney still working. He had no insurance, no savings, no family left to call. For 22 years, Clifton Reese had done one thing that nobody ever asked him to do and nobody ever paid him back for. Every Thursday morning, before the paying customers arrived, he cut hair for free. Not for everyone, just for men who were about to walk into a job interview for the first time in their lives. Men who had been incarcerated. Men who had been homeless. Men who had spent years being told by the world that they didn't belong anywhere respectable, and who were about to walk into a room and try to prove it wrong, one handshake at a time. Clifton never charged them, never wrote their names down, never asked what they'd done or where they'd been. He just said, "Sit down," and he made them look like somebody. Then, on a Wednesday night in October, 63 of those men showed up at the door of his barbershop. What they brought with them would change everything. If you've ever been to Beale Street in Memphis, you know the barbershops. There's one on almost every block in the neighborhoods just north of downtown, the kind of places where the chairs are older than the stylists and the conversation never stops. Clifton's was on Auction Avenue, a narrow storefront wedged between a check-cashing place and a laundromat that had been there since 1987. The sign above the door read Reese in red block letters, though the paint had faded so badly that the E looked more like an F. He'd been meaning to repaint it for 6 years. Clifton Reese was 54 years old. Medium height, wide shoulders, the kind of hands that looked like they'd been built for exactly one thing: holding scissors and doing it right. He had a slow way of talking and a quick way of listening, and the combination made people trust him the way you trust a doctor who doesn't rush you out of the office. He had opened Reese's when he was 32, with a loan from his mother, a woman named Eunice who had worked 30 years at a garment factory and saved money like it was something that could disappear overnight, because she had seen it disappear overnight. Eunice Reese believed in 3 things: church, hard work, and the idea that how a man presents himself to the world tells the world how to treat him back. She used to say that to Clifton when he was small, pressing his collar flat with the palm of her hand before school. "You walk looking like you belong, baby." The rest follows. She died when Clifton was 38. Heart attack, fast, no warning. He closed the shop for a week, which cost him more than he could afford. And he sat in her kitchen in the house she'd raised him in and understood for the first time what it meant to be the last person standing in a family. He had no siblings. His father had left when Clifton was 4 and never came back in any form that counted. No wife, no children. Just the shop, the chair, the scissors that had been a gift from Eunice on the day he passed his state board exam. "You've got the hands for it," she'd told him. "Now, go make somebody feel like somebody." He carried that with him the way you carry a thing that is heavy enough to anchor you. The Thursday morning thing started by accident, the way most important things do. It was almost 8 years after he opened the shop. A man came in on a Thursday at 7:30, before Clifton had even flipped the sign. Young, maybe 26, wearing a button-down shirt that was ironed but too big for him, collar loose, cuffs rolled wrong. He had the look of someone who had borrowed clothes and wasn't used to the fit. He knocked on the glass and held up one hand in a way that was almost apologetic, like he already knew the answer was going to be no. Clifton opened the door. The man's name was something Clifton never asked. That was the rule he made for himself right then. Before the man sat down, before the scissors were out, he didn't ask because he had seen enough of life to know that some men come to you already carrying too much, and the last thing they need is one more person requiring them to explain themselves. The man had been out of prison for 11 days. He had a job interview at a warehouse on the south side at 9 o'clock. He had $7 in his pocket. A full cut and a shape-up cost $22 at Reese's. Clifton sat him down and got to work. The man was quiet for most of it. He watched himself in the mirror the way people watch themselves when they're not used to looking. Not vanity, something else. Something closer to recognition. Like he was trying to remember who he was before everything happened, or maybe trying to see who he might be after. When Clifton finished, the man looked at himself for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and put the $7 on the counter. Clifton pushed it back. "Go get that job." The man looked at him. He didn't say thank you right away. He just sat there for a moment, hands on his knees, looking at his reflection like he wanted to memorize it. "Thank you, sir." His voice was low. "I'm going to come back and pay you when I'm working." "You don't owe me anything," Clifton said. "Just go in there looking like you belong." The man left. Clifton never saw him again. He didn't know if he got the job. He didn't know if he made it or didn't make it, or gave up or started over somewhere else. He just knew that on that Thursday morning, for the 12 minutes it took to cut that man's hair, somebody who had been told, in every possible way, that he didn't matter, had sat in a chair and been treated like he did. That was enough. It had to be enough. The Thursday morning appointment started quietly. Word moved through the reentry programs, through the halfway houses, through the community center on Thomas Street that helped men coming out of Shelby County Correctional. No advertisement, no sign, nothing official. Just the way information spreads in communities that have learned not to trust official channels. If you've got an interview and you can't pay, go to Reese's on auction before 8 on Thursday. Ask for Clifton. He'll take care of you. Some weeks nobody came. Other weeks 3 men sat waiting when Clifton unlocked the door. He never kept track of the numbers. He just cut hair, shaped hairlines, trimmed beards, told men to sit up straight and look at themselves like they meant it, because the mirror doesn't show you what you are. It shows you what you believe you are, and that's the version that walks into a room. He had his rules. He never asked what they'd been convicted of. He never asked how long they'd been inside. He never asked about families or failures or what happened before. He asked one question: "What time is your interview?" And from that he worked backwards, made sure they were done and out the door with enough time to walk in calm. 22 years. That was how long it went on. And Clifton never told anyone, not because he was humble about it, though he was, but because it was never about being seen. His mother hadn't cooked for the neighbors to be thanked. She'd cooked because hungry people were in front of her and she had food. Clifton cut hair because men who needed to look like themselves were sitting in his chair and he had scissors. Simple as that. But here's what nobody in his shop, nobody on Auction Avenue, nobody in any of the programs or halfway houses or community centers ever knew. Every Thursday, after the free cuts were done and the paying customers started arriving, Clifton went into the back room and sat down on a crate next to the water heater and gave himself 5 minutes. Not to rest, to breathe. Because for 3 years, breathing had been getting harder. It started as fatigue, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Then swelling in his ankles that he told himself was from standing all day. Then pressure behind his eyes that he blamed on the fluorescent lights. He adjusted things slowly, quietly, without telling anyone, because Clifton Reese had been the only person in his world for a long time, and he had learned to handle things alone. You don't call for help when there's no one to call. 14 months ago, he fainted in the back room, hit the floor next to the crate where he always sat. A customer heard it from the other side of the curtain and called an ambulance. The diagnosis came back like a verdict. Chronic kidney disease, stage 4. Both kidneys functioning at 18%. He needed dialysis. Possibly a transplant. Definitely. Immediately, he needed to stop working the hours he was working and get into treatment before the number dropped any lower. "Do you have insurance?" the doctor asked. "No." "Do you have family who can be tested as a potential donor?" "No." "Mr. Reese, you need to understand the seriousness." Clifton thanked the doctor for his time and walked out of the clinic. He went back to the shop the next morning. He didn't stop the Thursday appointments. He just started keeping a stool behind the chair so he could sit between customers when the dizziness came, and he made sure to angle himself so no one could see his hands shake. He told himself he was fine. He told himself there was time. There wasn't much time. To understand why Clifton became the man who cut hair for free on Thursday mornings, you have to go back to a different barber shop, in a different city and a different era. Memphis, 1988. Clifton was 17 years old and his father had been gone for 13 years, which meant he had been gone for basically Clifton's entire conscious life, which meant Clifton had no model for what a man was supposed to look like standing up straight. He got into trouble the way boys get into trouble when there's no one watching and nothing to look forward to. Small things first, then less small, then. One night, he was standing in a parking lot with 3 other boys, and a situation happened that he had not planned for, and by the end of it, he had done something that could not be undone. And the next morning, he was sitting in a room being told what his life was going to look like for the next portion of it. He was 17. The judge looked at him for a long time before the sentencing. There was a lawyer present who had been appointed by the court. The lawyer was young, recently graduated, assigned to cases like this, as part of something that did not feel entirely like justice, but was the version of it that existed. His name was a name Clifton forgot later, which tells you what the interaction felt like. But the lawyer did one thing that Clifton did not forget. The night before the sentencing, the lawyer came to the detention center. He brought a dress shirt in a plastic bag from the dry cleaner, Clifton's size. He had guessed right. He told Clifton to wear it to court the next morning. He said, "I know this isn't fair. I know you're scared. I know the system isn't built for you. But tomorrow you're going to walk in there and you're going to look like you have somewhere to be after this is over, because you do. You understand me? You have somewhere to be after this." Clifton wore the shirt. The judge looked at him for that long moment, and then the judge said something that judges almost never say in rooms that look like that room. He said he was going to give Clifton a chance. Juvenile facility, not adult, 2 years, with eligibility for early release. It was not a gift. It was still 2 years of his life at 17. But it was the version of those 2 years that left a door open, and Clifton walked out of that door and never looked back because he had somewhere to be. A shirt in a dry cleaning bag and a sentence from a tired lawyer had told him so. He thought about that shirt every Thursday morning. Standing behind his chair, scissors in hand, a man in front of him who needed someone to tell him the same thing the lawyer had told him. You have somewhere to be after this. Look like it. When the real estate notice arrived in December, Clifton read it twice, standing at the counter of his shop with the fluorescent lights buzzing and a customer waiting in chair 2. The building had been sold, new owners. They were converting the property to mixed-use residential. Reese's had 60 days to vacate. Clifton folded the letter and put it in his apron pocket. He finished the customer in chair 2. He thanked the man when he paid, the same way he always did, and then he stood at the window after the man left and looked out at Auction Avenue in the gray December light. 22 years. The chair, the scissors, the stool he'd put behind the counter when his legs started to go. The photographs on the wall that customers had brought in over the years, barbershop tradition, boxers and basketball players and old neighborhood portraits. The smell of clippers and aftershave, and the specific warm closeness of a place where men came to sit still for a while. If he lost the shop, he lost the Thursday appointments. If he lost Thursday, he lost the one thing that had made all the rest of it feel like it was pointing somewhere. He went upstairs to his apartment above the shop. He'd been renting it from the same building owner for 15 years. And he sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his hands. His mother's voice came back to him as it always did. You've got the hands for it. He wondered what good hands were worth when everything they'd built was being taken. He didn't tell anyone. He hadn't told anyone about the kidneys either. He had gotten very good over a lifetime of being alone, at carrying weight silently. But somewhere in this city, at that exact moment, someone who remembered Clifton's hands was already starting to put something together. Darius Webb was 39 years old and worked in logistics at a shipping company on the east side of Memphis. He had a wife, 2 kids in middle school, a mortgage on a small house in Whitehaven, that he was proud of in the specific quiet way that men are proud of things they built from nothing. 10 years ago, Darius Webb had walked into Reese's barbershop on a Thursday morning at 7:45 with $14 in his pocket and a job interview at 9 and a hairline that had grown out so badly he'd stopped looking in mirrors. He'd been out for 8 months. The interview was for a warehouse position that paid $12.50 an hour, not much. Enough. Clifton had cut his hair without asking a single question about where he'd been or what he'd done. Had shaped his beard with a precision that felt, to Darius, almost ceremonial, and had sent him out the door with 18 minutes to get to the interview, saying nothing more than what he always said. Walk in there like you belong. Darius got the job. He never forgot it. He came back to pay Clifton 6 weeks later with the money from his first paycheck. Clifton told him to keep it. Darius came back again with coffee and a handshake. Clifton accepted the coffee. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The Grizzlies, property taxes, the state of Beale Street. And then Darius left, and he thought about that haircut often in the years that followed. The way you think about a small thing that turned out to be the hinge everything else swung on. He drove past the shop sometimes. Not to stop, just to drive past and know it was still there. The faded sign, the light in the window. Still there. One Tuesday evening in December, he drove past and saw a notice taped to the door. He pulled over and read it through the glass. He sat in his car for a long time. Then he called a man named Terrence Oakes, who had been out with him in the same facility years ago and had his own story about a Thursday morning at Reese's. Terrence called a man named Phil Gaston, who had gotten a Thursday cut before an interview for a city job he'd held for 6 years. Phil called 3 others. It went that way through phone calls and text messages, and a group chat that someone named Cedric started and titled simply Clifton's Guys. Within a week, there were 41 people in the group. Within 2 weeks, 63. They came from all over the city. Some from re-entry programs. Some who had turned their lives around years ago and were now coaches, managers, drivers, mechanics. One was a paramedic. One ran his own landscaping company. One had gone back to school and was finishing a degree in social work, which, as he wrote in the group chat, felt directly related to a Thursday haircut a long time ago. Not one of them had ever given Clifton their name. Not one of them had ever been asked. But every one of them had carried the memory of that chair like something stitched into them. They found out about the shop closing through Darius. They found out about the kidneys through a woman named Georgette, who volunteered at the community health center and had been quietly worried about Clifton for months after seeing him at a health screening, where he'd clearly been minimizing his symptoms to the volunteer who took his blood pressure. The group went quiet for a long time after Georgette shared what she knew. Then Darius typed 3 words. What do we do? It wasn't a question. They planned it over 2 weeks. Darius coordinated. Terrence made calls. Georgette, who had experience organizing community health events, handled the medical piece, reaching out to a nonprofit that helped uninsured patients access dialysis coverage through a patchwork of grants and charity care programs she had spent years learning to navigate. The paramedic, whose name was Anthony Hurd, got himself tested quietly at the hospital where he worked. He didn't tell anyone in the group why, just that he was looking into something. They set a date. A Wednesday night. They made a plan, and Clifton had no idea. 63 men. 63 different lives. 63 stories that started in the same chair on Thursday mornings and went in 63 different directions, and all of them led back to the same door on Auction Avenue. On that Wednesday evening, Clifton sat in the apartment above his shop in the dark. He hadn't turned on the lights. He sat on the edge of his bed in the gray from the street lamps outside, and on the nightstand next to him were 2 pieces of paper. The eviction notice and a prescription he hadn't filled because the copay was more than he made on a slow week. He looked at his hands. His mother had believed in these hands. A lawyer he couldn't remember the name of had believed in them too, in a different way. He had done what he could with them. 22 years. More men than he could count. He didn't regret a single Thursday. But the shop was going, his body was going, and there was no one to call. He closed his eyes. Then someone knocked on the door downstairs. Clifton didn't move. The knock came again, louder, then a third time. Not impatient, something else. Certain. The knock of someone who knew the person inside was there and wasn't leaving until he answered. He pulled himself up, went downstairs through the shop, unlocked the front door. Darius Webb stood on the sidewalk. Behind Darius, Auction Avenue was full. Men, dozens of them, standing in the street and on the sidewalk and stretching back half a block. Some of them in work clothes, some in dress clothes, some in the kind of casual Thursday morning attire of men who had put on their best to come here tonight. A few of them held signs. Most of them held nothing. They just stood there, quiet in the way that large groups are sometimes quiet when the moment is too big for noise. Clifton looked at them. He didn't recognize a single face, but every single one of them recognized his. Mr. Reese, Darius's voice was steady. You cut my hair on a Thursday morning 10 years ago. I had 8 months out and $14, and you didn't ask me a thing. You just made me look like someone who was going somewhere. He paused. I've been going somewhere ever since. A man behind Darius spoke. You did the same for me, see. 7 years ago. I've got my own company now. 8 employees. Another voice. I walked into that interview and got the job. I've been there 4 years. My son thinks I hung the moon. Another. I wasn't going to go. I was going to walk past the building and keep walking. But I'd been to your shop that morning and I looked in the window of that office building and I saw myself and I thought, maybe. And I went in. Another. You told me to sit up straight. I still hear that. Another. You fixed my collar before I left. I don't think you even knew you did it. You just reached over and fixed it like it was the most natural thing. Nobody had fixed anything of mine in a long time. The voices came one at a time. Not rehearsed, not loud, just true. Men saying out loud what they had carried quietly for years. Simple sentences that landed in the cold December air and didn't go anywhere. Clifton stood in the doorway of the shop he was losing, one hand on the frame, and listened. He was a man who had cut 10,000 heads of hair and asked nothing in return. And he had gotten good at believing that was fine, that it was enough to give without receiving, that the invisible work was still work even if nobody saw it. He had not prepared himself for being seen. A man stepped forward from the middle of the group. He was younger than most of them, late 20s, wearing paramedic blues. Anthony Hurd. He looked at Clifton directly. Mr. Reese, my name is Anthony. I came to your shop on a Thursday morning 6 years ago. I had been out 9 months, and I had an interview with the fire department for a paramedic certification program, and I didn't own a mirror that worked. He stopped, took a breath. I've been a paramedic for 4 years. Last year, I saved a man's life on Beale Street. I think about your scissors every time I think about that call, because I don't know if I'm standing here without that morning. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I got tested at Regional last week. I'm a match, Mr. Reese, for your kidney. The sidewalk went silent. I want to donate, Anthony said, if you'll let me. Clifton shook his head. He said what he had to say. That Anthony was young. That Anthony had a life ahead of him. That a haircut wasn't worth a kidney. That nothing he'd ever done was worth that. You didn't fix my collar because it was worth something, Anthony said. You did it because it needed doing and you were standing there. That's all. That's the whole reason. He didn't look away. I'm standing here. It needs doing. Let me. Clifton looked at Anthony for a long time, a paramedic who had gotten his start in a barbershop chair on a cold Thursday morning. The math didn't make sense, and it made perfect sense simultaneously. Darius stepped forward again. There's one more thing. He held up his phone so Clifton could see the screen. A GoFundMe page. A photograph of the shop. The faded sign, the light in the window, the wobbly display case in the front that had been wobbly for years, and a number at the top of the page. $91,000. Clifton looked at the number. He blinked. Looked at Darius. Looked back at the screen. 3 days, Darius said. We set it up 3 days ago. The money is for your dialysis, your treatment, everything you need to stay alive long enough for a transplant to happen. Whatever the charity care program doesn't cover, this does. You're taken care of, Mr. Reese. You just have to let us take care of you. Clifton couldn't speak. He stood in the doorway of his shop with his hand on the frame and looked at 63 men who were proof that the Thursday mornings had gone somewhere. They had gone everywhere, into warehouses and ambulances and landscaping trucks and courtrooms and middle school gymnasiums where fathers were watching their kids play. They had gone into lives. He'd thought he was cutting hair. He'd been building something he couldn't see. They didn't only come with words and money. The week after that Wednesday night, Darius made a phone call to the new property owners. He came with a folder that contained, among other things, letters from 6 city council members, a feature story from the Memphis Commercial Appeal about Reese's, and the Thursday appointments that had run with 63 names attached, and a community petition with 1,100 signatures collected in 4 days. The property owner, a developer based in Nashville who had bought the building as part of a portfolio investment and had never set foot in Memphis, read the coverage and asked his assistant to arrange a call. On that call, Darius did not negotiate. He told the story the same way it had played out on the sidewalk, the Thursday mornings. The men. The paramedic. The $91,000 raised in 72 hours. He said one thing at the end that was not a request. Mr. Reese's shop has been on that corner for 22 years. The corner is part of the shop. We'd like to keep it there. The developer was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would look at his options. 2 days later, his assistant called back. The lease would be renewed at the current rate, 5-year term, with a clause that named Reese's Barber Shop as a protected community tenant. It was not altruism. There was good press involved, and there was pressure. But the outcome was real, regardless of the motive. The shop stayed. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday. That wasn't planned. It just happened to fall that way. And when Clifton noticed the day on the hospital paperwork, he sat with it for a moment and thought about the things that don't have explanations but feel, nonetheless, like something. Anthony came into his room the night before the procedure. He sat in the chair beside the bed, still in his work clothes. Off shift. They talked the way 2 people talk when they don't need to perform anything for each other. Clifton asked about the paramedic work, and Anthony told him a story about a call that had gone badly and how he'd gotten through it. Clifton told him about the lawyer with the dry-cleaned shirt, the story he'd never told anyone. Anthony listened the way Clifton listened behind the chair, without interruption, with his full attention. "Why did you never tell anyone about the Thursday cuts?" Anthony asked at some point. Clifton thought about it. "My mother used to say that if you do a good thing loud, you're not really doing it for the other person." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted it to be for them." Anthony nodded. They sat in silence for a while. The hospital was quiet in the way hospitals are quiet at night, which is not peaceful exactly, but is still. The next morning they wheeled both of them down the corridor side by side. Clifton looked at the ceiling moving overhead and thought about Eunice Reese pressing his collar flat with the palm of her hand. He thought about a parking lot in 1988 and a door that stayed open. He thought about a man he'd never learned the name of, sitting in the chair for the first time, looking at himself in the mirror like he was trying to remember who he was. He thought about 63 men standing on Auction Avenue in the December cold and the way none of them had needed to say very much because the simple fact of them being there said everything that needed saying. The surgery took 4.5 hours. Darius sat in the waiting room the entire time. So did Terrence. So did Georgette, who had brought coffee for everyone and kept refilling cups and not sitting down. So did a man named Phil Gaston, who had a city job he'd held for 6 years because of a Thursday morning, and who had texted his wife from the waiting room. "I'm at the hospital for the barber. I'll be home late." His wife had texted back, "Give him our love." When Darius walked down the hall after and saw the surgical team coming out, he didn't need to ask. He could read it in the walk. Both of them were fine. When Clifton woke up in recovery, the room was dim, and the machines were beeping their quiet, steady beeps, and his side ached in a way that was new and strange. He turned his head. On the small table beside the bed, his scissors, the ones his mother had given him the day he passed his boards. the ones he'd used for 22 years. Darius had called Clifton's landlord and asked where he might find them, and the landlord had let him into the apartment. And he had wrapped them in a cloth and brought them to the hospital that morning so they'd be there when Clifton opened his eyes, so he'd see something familiar, Darius had told the nurse. So he knows he's not starting over. He's still the same person. Clifton reached out and put his hand over the cloth without unwrapping it. He could feel the shape of the scissors through the fabric. His mother's voice. "You've got the hands for it." He lay there with his hand on the scissors and let himself cry quietly, the way he'd done most important things in his life. Without an audience, without performance, just the feeling and the fact of it. He had a new kidney, he had a shop. He had 63 men who had no reason to remember him except that they couldn't forget him. He had thought he'd spent 22 years cutting hair. He understood now that he had been doing something else the whole time. He'd been telling men who had been told they were nothing that they were something, with scissors, with 15 minutes, with a hand that reached over and fixed a collar without even thinking about it. You don't know what you're building when you build it small. You only know later when it comes back to you. 6 months after the surgery, Reese's barber shop on Auction Avenue reopened. The sign had been repainted. The E was an E again, and there was a new chair in the corner that a group of the men had chipped in to buy, which Clifton accepted because he had learned, over those months, how to receive. It was harder than giving, in the way that all harder things are worth learning. The Thursday morning appointments continued. They had never stopped, exactly. Darius had kept the chair warm during the months Clifton was recovering, doing rough cuts himself and bringing in a volunteer from a cosmetology program to do the real work. But when Clifton came back behind his own chair on the first Thursday of March, the line was already out the door before he unlocked it. He still didn't ask names, still didn't ask what happened, still said one question, "What time is your interview?" And still said one thing when they left. One afternoon in April, a young man came in. Not on a Thursday, a regular Tuesday walk-in. He was maybe 20, wearing a basketball jersey, carrying himself the way people carry themselves when they've learned not to expect much. He looked at the price board on the wall and then at the money in his hand and then back at the board. "You looking for a cut?" Clifton said. "Yeah. But I'm a little short. I can come back." Clifton had heard those words hundreds of times in 100 different registers. He recognized the shape of them. "When's your interview?" The young man looked at him. "How did you know? Come on and sit down." The young man sat. Clifton pulled the cape around his shoulders. He looked in the mirror, that first uncertain look, and Clifton could see him figuring out who he was supposed to be in this chair. "Sit up straight," Clifton said, not unkindly, just straight. And the young man sat up and looked at himself. And something in his face shifted, the way it always shifted, the way Clifton had been watching it shift for 22 years and 4 months. The work doesn't always come back to you in a way you can see. Most of the time it goes out, and you never know where it lands. But sometimes, if you stay at it long enough, you get to see the shape of what you built. Not because you need to. It was always enough to do the work. But because the world occasionally does the grace of showing you that it mattered. Clifton Reese held the scissors the way his mother told him to, and kept cutting.